Hey class, today we're going to be looking at the two main forms of government, federal and unitary for 4.7. So the things you need to know for the AP exam is the ability to be able to define federal and unitary states and explain how federal and unitary states affect spatial organization. So we're going to get into some of those details. So forms of governance include unitary states and federal states. Unitary states tend to have a more top-down approach with centralized government, while federal states have more locally based and dispersed power centers. So we'll look at some examples here. So in terms of where power is held, where's the authority? Where are these decisions being made? In a federal state or a federal country, this is where the government shares the power between central, regional, and local governments. So the power is not totally centralized. Instead, we see it spread out to where regional and local governments have the ability to make some of their own decisions. Regional and local governments have autonomy and authority to administer their spaces in order to account for the needs of diverse groups. So that is the idea behind it, where maybe in a geographically large country, that might be difficult to do, where the centralized government is making all the decisions. That allows different groups to have some autonomy over themselves, and it's built into that system. So unitary power or unitary governments is where the power is held in that centralized government, so in that main government, and regional or local units carry out that policy. So even though they do exist, they do not independently make laws and policy. Instead, their role is to be an extension of that centralized government, and enforce these policies or implement these policies that were decided at the central level, right? So here we have the central government kind of dictating what the different states within their country need to do, whereas with the federal government, that's not the case. The smaller forms of government, the states and local government, are able to make some of their own decisions. So in terms of spatial organization for federal governments, power is diffused to state and local governments on multiple levels. Multinational and geographically large countries tend to adopt this model because it makes it a little bit easier in order to meet the needs of diverse populations. So here we see the sub-state or the overall country, then the county level or the smaller level, and then the city and local level, which is the smallest level of government or smallest scale of government in this example. For unitary states, there's very little political power outside of the central government. And if there's a diffusion of power, it's limited and it's not built into their system. States are more likely geographically compact with less cultural differences and minority groups. So if a country has a homogeneous population, if geographically they're a small country, unitary government tends to make more sense. So some of the positives about federal governments is that there's less conflict around specific issues because each different area, each region can legislate differently. So in the US, a couple of examples would be the death penalty or legalization of marijuana. So not every state within the United States uses the death penalty. That is up to the decision of the state. Same thing with legalization of marijuana. We see different laws and policies from state to state because the main government, the federal government, has decided to not make those decisions for death penalty or legalization of marijuana. So local issues are also resolved more quickly by regional and local governments. So if there's an issue going on in a particular area of a country, they don't need to go all the way to the main centralized federal government. Instead, they can go to their regional government. For unitary states, they tend to be far more efficient in the creation and implementation of laws because this is all coming from one centralized authority, one centralized place. So that just makes it more streamlined, far more straightforward Change also happens quickly because there's only one channel, one centralized channel that they have to go through, and it tends to have a greater sense of unity. So in a unitary state, you would not see all these different policies happening in different areas of the country. Instead, it would be one centralized policy that would be implemented quickly and across the board. So some downsides to federal government, it is slower to enact change. So for instance, let's say with the US, amending the Constitution does take a lot more agreement, a lot more unity for that to happen. Also, conflicts between national, state, and local level government units can cause confusion and stall progress. So you might see cases going up to the Supreme Court because they want the federal government's input if there's any kind of disagreements or conflicts. So some downsides to unitary governments, they tend to be more vulnerable to corruption or authoritarianism because it's only that one level of government. They may only serve the interests of the dominant group since we don't have regionalized governments to help represent maybe smaller ethnic groups or religious groups, any other kind of minority groups. Central government may not be in touch with local issues. So what's happening in one area of the country, if it's a little bit more remote or not as well connected, then central government might not realize or have that as a priority. And they tend to be, because of that, are slower to respond to local issues. So that's